and do something!
Welcome back. This is episode 2. It's been a really fun past week. Been very busy, but excited to kind of get back to conversations about family and about roots. I brought some snacks for after I'm done recording. I found out that there's green varieties of these little tomatoes, and that's really good when they're pickled. I also made sure to bring myself a little something to enjoy while I'm hanging out with y'all. This is a local one. That's all I'm going to say about it. But hey, it's better than what I was drinking last time. So, during the first episode, what I was talking about, got my notebook here, this thing, we'll get there eventually. This thing is a lifesaver. But what we're touching on now are some people who essentially inspired my ancestors. And so we're going pretty far back. And before I really continue, I think that an important thing, because this is a new definition for me, this is not a word that I was really familiar with, or at least that I was aware that I had heard before, because it sounds really similar to another word that it's related to. It's the difference between the words immigrate and emigrate. And essentially, my understanding of it is, if you immigrate, there is a sort of pulling you to a place, whereas emigrate means that you are being pushed to a place. And so where we're kind of starting is the 1600s. And essentially what was going on during this time period is complicated, so I'm going to kind of oversimplify it. But I would definitely recommend that if you're into this kind of stuff, I've spent probably 2 weeks, maybe more, just studying this part. And what was going on was the King of England and Scotland was having some issues with some of the folks that were living on the borders of Scotland and England. So basically, southern Scotland and then northern England. And what the issues were was that it was such a large area that the king wanted to make sure that he would be able to maintain control over it. But there were some pesky folks that lived near the border who he was having trouble kind of ruling, because they lived off the land and they were poor, and the worst thing of all of this is that they actually had relatives on both sides of the border. And so you had relatives of the same families that were either Scottish or English. And so in order to try and figure out how to fix this, how to organize it, how to control it, a couple years in, so now we're talking about 1606, this guy gets the great idea to essentially go into Northern Ireland, and this is a region called Ulster, and essentially steals land from all of the indigenous people of the island. There were Gaelic nobles that lived in that region, and basically the king swept them out. And, you know, there's a lot of different words that they were using, like surrendered it, confiscated it, but it was stolen. So anyway, the way that he ended up enticing these people who were out living near the border is he basically said, hey, life isn't so great for you over here. Those mosquitoes, I'm getting at them again. Life isn't so great for you over here. So we just took over this one spot over in Ireland, and if you'd be willing to basically, protect what they actually called a plantation, if you'd be willing to protect it, you could live there. And, you'll have more religious flexibility. There's going to be more economic opportunity. There's going to be more land available to your people. All you got to do is help protect it. So, they accept, and they start moving people out. And, these backcountry guys, man, they knew what they were doing. One of the things I was reading about is they were actually scalping the Irish for bounty. And those kinds of details, as brutal as they are, will definitely matter later on as we move along in the history. Because they started to kind of build a reputation for really being rough. And so, you have this situation where the Irish feel like they've been slighted. So there's raids on Ulster frequently. And slowly over time, more and more Scots start going out there, and some of these northern British start going out there and participating. And we start getting a little bit further into the century. And it becomes kind of important to talk about another detail if we do that. And that's the difference between Catholicism and then the Presbyterians and the Protestants. The big difference here is that, as many of you probably know, the Catholics have their leadership stand between the congregation and God. So essentially they're representatives. They're like politicians, but for Jesus. I might get distracted because there's a critter out here somewhere. I can hear it, but I can't see it yet. Anyway. So what was going on was basically the Church of England, over time, had been trying really, really hard to pull these guys in. And they really hated the idea that on faith alone, any believer could communicate directly with God rather than having this power structure. Boy, I don't know what that creature is. Anyway. There's no division, and so it was challenging for them to maintain this power structure. So, what they said was to these other Scots and British, well, hey, look, you're not going to have rights unless you decide to join with the Church of England. But you'll have more flexibility, we won't fucking kill you if you move to Ulster. And there you can call yourself this thing and do you, and we'll leave you alone. So, it was kind of an interesting situation because they were enticed by the flexibility, but they were lacking freedom because, and I'm not sure if this word here would really be applicable, I'd have to look it up, but it was a sort of theocracy, where if you didn't belong to the particular church, then you couldn't vote, you couldn't own land, etc. And so they started kind of getting upset. You start getting, into the next generation of people, and they start waking up in Ulster and going like, well, how did we end up getting the short end of the stick? So then the king fucks up pretty bad. Because he didn't really know these people. So, all along, they've been doing raids on the Irish, they've been protecting from the Irish, they've been taking the scalp off and selling that for money. So, there's not a lot of good blood between these guys and the Irish, right? Well, in 1630, the king he tries again to basically, but this time, force even those in Ulster to join the Church of England and submit to its protocol and its leadership. And that was not a good idea. What ends up happening at about the same time period is the first of many consecutive Irish rebellions that happened between, that one got close, the 1630s and the 1650s. Now, around this same time period is when you start having these people from Ulster emigrating to North America, which we won't really touch on in this episode. The rest of them, however, did something that I bet the king probably wasn't expecting. And they switched sides. So basically, all of these Ulsters, they say to the Irish, hey, we kind of want to practice our religion. So, like, we're really sorry for, like, scalping all of your pals. But if you want to hate on the British, we can help you hate on the British. So, they end up joining with the Irish and essentially trying to push the British out of Ulster and the rest of Ireland. And it didn't quite work. They weren't not successful. They definitely had an impact. But what then ends up happening, which was an interesting sort of twist that only serendipity could really predict, there were these famines that happened in Scotland. And so you have this situation where through this conflict, the Irish are still trying to push north into Ulster, and they're still, like, now that these guys living in Ulster are essentially surrounded on both sides by enemies, and only one of which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but otherwise, like, you know, once Britain's taken care of, what's going to go on here when the Gaelic decide, oh, hey, this is our land, by the way, you've got to figure some shit out. So, during this time, you still have more people who are emigrating to North America. I'm imagining, you know, living in a fucking conflict zone isn't a very comfortable place to be. And so, this thing that happens, this is now way forward, right? So this is in 1690. In 1690, there's a famine in Scotland. And they all emigrated to Ulster. And for the first time, basically had a population advantage. So there were more of these southern Scotland, northern British living in this area than anyone else. And it was kind of a turning point for everything at that point. So what you have is, about 10 years later, even more pressure from the Church of England and from Britain, from the Irish, that almost completely decimated the people who were living in Ulster. There were a couple of turning points in the conflicts that basically staved off this problem, one of which being the famine. And the others actually being the British, coming back in and kind of pushing back the Irish, reestablishing Ulster, and so on. But all of this conflict that was happening, you end up seeing some of the largest emigrations so far. So you get 150,000 people from Ulster who go to North America. So then you go forward about 20 years, so you know, we've now sped through multiple generations. I'd say probably 2 to 3 generations, if not more, between where we started this and where we are now. And so, you know, you got to think, like, when you remember emigrating, you're probably a little bit more gracious about what it is that you have compared to what you remember you didn't have. But when you're one of these young bucks that grows up feeling entitled to all of these things because you've always had it, it's hard to submit. So, in 1717 through 1775, you essentially have a period of increasing conflict in Ireland, and then also an incredibly increased amount of emigration. So through that time period, you end up having another 200,000 people from Ulster move to North America. So now we've got 350,000 people that have moved there before the American Revolution. And these guys do not like the British. So you can kind of imagine how this ends up setting things up for what's going to be happening later on. So the ones that stayed behind, it's like they finally decided on their flip, and this really speaks to exactly how much they really disliked them. Because they end up joining with a group that's called, I believe it's the United Irish. And essentially what they ended up doing was really spectacular. Especially if you think about all the different schools of thought kind of doing this within anarchism. They put aside all of their religious differences. So you had Presbyterians, Protestants, Catholic. There's another one in there that I'm forgetting the name of. You got all these people put aside all their differences because they hated the British that much. So you end up having these Irish rebellions that had casualties on both sides of the conflict. And I find this a fascinating time period because the British did win this conflict. And so really the ones that decided to emigrate lucked out, because there were a lot of casualties. But I find this fascinating, and I'll have to just kind of do this in my own reading. But I had no idea that there was this much conflict that was going on prior to when they finally had a successful secession from British rule. What happens in North America, I'm excited to share. This was all kind of necessary to set up that story. And it is an interesting story, but I wouldn't call it a good one because it simply continues its path of brutality. But with that said, that's the end of this episode. I'm trying to keep this stuff short. So, cheers to you.